She said, "This exam requires extra attention." But when she leaned closer, everything changed. It was a crisp, early afternoon when I found myself standing in the waiting room of Dr. Grace Winter's office. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with a faint scent of lavender from a diffuser in the corner, giving the room an oddly comforting, yet clinical feel. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to mirror the nervous buzz in my chest. I had never been to a female doctor before, and the thought of seeing someone as highly regarded as Dr. Winters added a layer of unease to my already jittery nerves. I had heard of her reputation, calm, professional, and with an almost magnetic presence. The clinic had been buzzing about her for months, and I was curious, almost to the point of needing to see for myself. As I sat on the edge of the chair, anxiously flipping through a health magazine, the door to the office opened. I looked up, and there she was. Dr. Winters. Her presence filled the room effortlessly. She was taller than I expected, with shoulder-length dark hair that framed her face in a perfectly composed way. A few strands of silver threaded through her hair, but they only added to her allure, giving her a distinguished elegance. Her eyes, warm and kind, met mine for just a brief moment, and in that instant, I felt an inexplicable pull. It was subtle, but undeniable. She greeted me with a smile that was both professional and friendly, offering her hand for a shake. Her fingers were delicate, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she held my hand, not too firm, not too soft. I tried to compose myself, to focus on the task at hand, a routine physical exam. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something in her presence, that made me feel both at ease and inexplicably exposed. As she led me down the narrow hallway to the exam room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. There was no rush in her movements, everything about her was deliberate, calculated, and yet effortless. She was in no hurry. For someone so clearly accomplished, it seemed like time moved differently when she was around. And I couldn't help but feel as though the world had slowed down just for us. The room we entered was spacious, the walls a pale blue that suggested calmness, with a single window letting in just enough light to soften the clinical edges. As she turned to face me, there was a moment of silence between us, a stillness that hung in the air, thick with anticipation. She asked me to take a seat on the exam table, and as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tension in the room wasn't just a result of the exam. She glanced at the medical chart in her hand, her eyes flicking over the details quickly before meeting mine again. Her gaze was steady, not overly probing, but there was an undeniable warmth behind it. She smiled again, and I felt my heartbeat pick up, though I tried to ignore it. "Let's get started," she said, her voice calm, steady. And yet, there was something in the way she said it, the way she made me feel like I was the only person in the room, the only person who mattered at that moment. I could feel the weight of her gaze even as she focused on the task at hand. It was subtle, but as she moved to grab her tools, I couldn't help but notice how her every movement seemed calculated, yet unforced. There was something undeniably graceful about her, something that made me want to stay in this moment a little longer, even as the reason for my visit remained strictly professional. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply observe her movements, the way she carried herself, how effortlessly she balanced the lines of authority and empathy. But what struck me most was the way she made me feel, comfortable, yet undeniably vulnerable. This wasn't just any ordinary appointment. Something, though I couldn't yet name it, was slowly stirring in me. The soft click of the door closing behind us was the first sound that broke the silence as Dr. Winters led me into the exam room. The space was bathed in a warm, neutral light, with a low hum from the air conditioning barely audible. The scent of antiseptic still lingered in the air, but there was something more here, the soft hint of lavender from the diffuser, the almost imperceptible warmth that seemed to emanate from the woman standing beside me. I couldn't place it, but the air felt different in her presence. Everything felt softer. She gestured toward the exam table with a calm, collected smile, her voice steady but warm. "Please, have a seat," she said, the invitation carrying no urgency. There was something so assured about her, as though time had slowed for us in this moment. Her words weren't rushed. She wasn't in a hurry. I was in the hands of someone who understood what it meant to make someone feel at ease, even in the most vulnerable of situations. I sat down on the exam table, my legs momentarily stiff beneath me. I tried to gather my thoughts, to push aside the disconcerting feeling that had settled in my chest. This was a simple checkup, just routine. I had been to plenty of doctors before, but this felt different. Her presence was unlike anything I had experienced. Dr. Winters was standing beside me now, flipping through the medical file, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She glanced over the information, her expression focused, but there was an undercurrent of kindness in her movements. Every gesture was precise, but never rushed. As she read through my chart, I found myself studying her, the way her fingers hovered over the papers with a delicacy that seemed out of place in such a clinical setting. It wasn't just the way she handled the chart, it was everything about her. Her calm demeanor, her presence, her grace. When she spoke again, her voice was like a balm to my nerves. "I'm going to ask you a few questions, just to get an idea of your overall health," she said, her eyes lifting to meet mine. Her gaze was steady, never too intense, but there was an underlying depth there that suggested she was attuned to everything happening around her. It was as if she could see past the surface, as though she could read what wasn't being said. I nodded, trying to focus on her words. But every movement, every glance, seemed to hold my attention more than the routine questions. When she asked me to take off my jacket, I did so, but as I did, I felt an almost imperceptible tension in the air. She moved toward me, and for the briefest moment, her arm brushed against mine as she adjusted the stethoscope hanging on the wall behind me. The touch was light, casual, but something in the contact made me feel seen. I tried not to dwell on the small, electric connection between us, but I couldn't ignore it. Her presence was consuming, and in a way, I didn't want to resist it. I couldn't shake the sensation that she was aware of everything, the unspoken tension in the room, the way I was still trying to push aside the growing awareness of how much she was affecting me. "Let's start with your blood pressure," she said, her voice bringing me back to the moment. Her hand moved to adjust the cuff on my arm, and I couldn't help but notice the way her fingers worked with practiced ease, gentle but firm. The contact was subtle, professional, yet I felt every second of it. The touch was brief, but in that moment, it felt like more than just a routine exam. There was something between us, something unspoken but palpable. As she moved around me, her proximity seemed to draw me in further. Her movements were graceful, measured, but there was an energy in the room that I couldn't quite place. I wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, I sat there, trying to hold on to the feeling of being both completely at ease and inexplicably on edge. And then, as she finished adjusting the cuff, she turned to me with that small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're doing great," she said, her voice soft and encouraging, but her eyes locked onto mine for just a beat too long. It was like an unspoken invitation, and though I couldn't quite grasp it, I knew something had shifted between us in that instant. There was an unspoken understanding in the air, something that lingered, almost like a promise, though neither of us spoke it aloud. The quiet click of the stethoscope against the metal counter marked the beginning of the examination. Dar. Winters moved with an ease that suggested she had performed this routine hundreds of times, yet there was an undeniable precision in every action she took, an attention to detail that made me feel both cared for and exposed in ways I hadn't anticipated. She stepped closer, her soft, calming voice filling the space between us. "Please lean back," she instructed, guiding me with a gentle touch to the exam table. As I reclined, the cool, sterile surface of the table pressed against my back, and I felt an almost imperceptible shift in the air. Her closeness was undeniable now. Her presence was everywhere, and though I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, I couldn't help but feel aware of every small detail, her warm breath, the quiet shuffle of her papers, the gentle rustle of her lab coat as she moved. Dr. Winters had begun her checkup, her fingers brushing against my chest as she placed the stethoscope. I couldn't help but notice how carefully she positioned it, the way her fingers lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, making me acutely aware of the warmth of her touch. Her eyes were focused on her task, but there was something in the way she looked at me, a brief, almost fleeting moment of softness, as though she was paying attention not just to the clinical side of the exam, but to me as a person. The rhythmic sound of the stethoscope against my chest seemed to drown out everything else in the room, leaving only the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Her fingers lightly pressed against my skin, and I felt the subtle tension of her touch, the gentleness of it. She didn't need to speak to communicate everything I needed to know. I could feel the professionalism in her movements, but there was an undeniable intimacy to them as well. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but there was something unspoken in the air, a shift that made the atmosphere feel different. She leaned in slightly, just close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body against mine. The subtle pressure of the stethoscope on my chest was nothing compared to the sensation of her presence filling the space around me. The moment felt almost too personal, yet I didn't want it to end. The touch of her hand on my shoulder as she adjusted the cuff felt electric in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just physical, it was a connection, unspoken but undeniable. Her voice was calm and steady as she asked the usual questions, but there was something in the way she made each word feel more important, more personal. I tried to focus on the exam, but the closeness, the softness of her touch, kept pulling me back, making it harder to breathe and impossible to think of anything else but her. I knew I shouldn't be feeling this way. This was supposed to be a routine exam. But her presence, her touch, made everything feel anything but ordinary. The exam had continued without interruption, but something in the air had shifted. As Dr. Winters leaned in to examine my vitals, the room seemed to shrink, drawing us into a space where time slowed. It was as if we were cocooned in a moment that was separate from everything outside, and in that moment, it wasn't just the physical proximity between us that heightened the tension, it was the unspoken connection that lingered, quiet and intense. She moved closer, her body nearly brushing against mine as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff. Her hand, light but purposeful, grazed my arm as she made the final adjustment, and for a split second, our eyes met. It was brief, just a glance, but there was a warmth in her gaze that made my heart skip a beat. There was no mistaking it. She knew. She knew exactly how I felt in this moment, just as I knew she was feeling the same quiet pull. Her touch was gentle, but it wasn't just the pressure of her fingers against my skin that made my pulse quicken. It was the deliberate way she moved, her proximity, the soft brush of her arm against mine. I could feel the heat of her body so close to mine, and with every movement, I felt more aware of her, of the way her breath came just a little faster, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she worked. She wasn't rushing through this exam. She wasn't in a hurry to finish. She was present. And in her presence, I couldn't escape the feeling that this was more than just a clinical procedure. We both seemed to pause for a moment, caught in the weight of the quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of papers, the soft press of the stethoscope against my chest, and the steady, rhythmic beat of my heart. I was acutely aware of how close she was, the warmth of her body, the softness of her touch, the subtle way she leaned in as she adjusted the cuff on my arm. The tension between us was palpable, but it was not uncomfortable. It was electric, in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. In that stillness, our gazes locked again, this time longer, more deliberate. There was something unspoken between us, an understanding that was never voiced, but felt deeply. Her smile was small, but it spoke volumes. There was no doubt in my mind now. She felt it too. There was a moment of vulnerability in her eyes, something rare, something real. She wasn't just performing an exam. She was with me in this moment, present and aware of everything unspoken between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I held her gaze, feeling the weight of the moment settle over us. The world outside the exam room seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us, suspended in this quiet, charged space. As the exam continued, there was a sudden shift. Dr. Winters paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone dropped slightly, a softness in her voice that made my breath catch. "This exam requires extra attention," she said, her words deliberate, almost measured. I couldn't help but wonder if she was aware of the tension in the room, the unspoken connection that had been quietly building between us. She didn't rush to finish, didn't make any attempt to distance herself from the moment. Instead, she leaned in closer, her body just inches away as she moved to adjust the equipment. Her proximity was undeniable now. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the slight shift of her body as she moved around me. When she reached over to adjust the stethoscope, her arm brushed against mine, and for the briefest of seconds, I felt the electric charge between us. It wasn't just a touch, it was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been building in the space between us. Her fingers were gentle, but there was an almost unspoken intention in the way she moved, careful, deliberate, yet unmistakably personal. She didn't look up immediately as she adjusted the cuff on my arm, but I caught a glimpse of the way her eyes flicked down to meet mine for a split second. It was as if she was waiting for me to say something, to break the silence that had settled over us. But I couldn't. I couldn't find the words. Instead, I simply sat there, feeling her presence all around me, her movements deliberate but filled with a quiet tenderness that sent a jolt of warmth through me. Dr. Winters was still focused on her task, but there was something in the way she moved, in the way she lingered near me, that made everything feel more intimate. She adjusted the equipment with a quiet precision, but her touch, even in its professional context, held an unexpected softness. The brief press of her fingers against my skin, the way she leaned in ever so slightly, all of it carried a meaning that I wasn't sure how to interpret. But I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't just about the exam. This was about something else. Her voice, when it came again, was calm but low, as if the space between us had grown smaller, more personal. "I just need to make sure everything is in order," she explained, her words almost a reassurance. But there was a depth in her tone, a certain weight to it, that made my heart race. I could hear the unspoken invitation in her words, the quiet acknowledgement that, perhaps, we were both aware of the unspoken pull between us. As she moved around me again, I noticed how close she was, how every subtle shift of her body seemed to bring her just a little bit nearer. My senses were heightened, every movement she made sending a ripple of awareness through me. The space between us was filled with a quiet, charged energy, and I could feel it growing with every second that passed. Neither of us said anything more, but the moment seemed to stretch on, as if we were both silently acknowledging the delicate tension that had woven itself into the room. The room had grown quieter, the subtle hum of the air conditioning now a distant background noise, as if it, too, recognized the delicate shift in the air. Dr. Winters continued with the exam, but the atmosphere between us had changed. It was no longer just a routine checkup, it had become something far more personal, more intimate. Her movements were deliberate, measured, but there was a lingering awareness in the space between us, a silent tension that neither of us acknowledged out loud but both felt keenly. She leaned in closer, her body slightly brushing mine as she adjusted the equipment. The closeness was electric, and despite her professional demeanor, there was an undeniable softness in the way she worked. Every touch, every glance, seemed infused with a quiet understanding, an unspoken desire to maintain a connection that went beyond the clinical. I could feel the warmth of her body so close to mine, and each subtle shift of her hand, each movement of her fingers, sent a ripple of awareness through me. I had to remind myself that this was an exam, that I shouldn't be reading too much into the way she lingered, the way she looked at me when she asked questions. But I couldn't help it. There was something in the way she moved, something in the way she focused on me with an intensity that felt more personal than professional. Her hands brushed against my skin with a deliberate gentleness, and I found myself drawn to the delicate warmth of her touch, the weight of her presence in the room. It was as if every part of me was tuned to her, attuned to the subtle rhythm of her body, her movements, her voice. As she asked me to breathe deeply, her fingers pressed lightly against my chest. I could feel the softness of her touch, the way her hand seemed to linger just a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't sexual, not in the way I might have imagined, but it was something more, a quiet, unspoken connection that neither of us was ready to break. The weight of her gaze lingered on me as I breathed, and for a moment, I felt utterly exposed. It wasn't just my body she was seeing, it felt like she was seeing me in a way no one else had, really seeing me for who I was, not just a patient in a medical setting. Her eyes were steady, and though she never said a word, I could sense the pull between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Her touch, her gaze, the way she hovered just inches away, everything about the moment spoke of something more than just a routine checkup. There was a quiet desire in the air, a longing that neither of us dared to voice. But I could feel it. She could, too. And we both knew that this moment, this connection, wasn't something either of us was ready to let go of just yet. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching the moment out until there was only the sound of our breathing, the weight of her touch, and the silent understanding that this was more than what it seemed. We were standing at the edge of something deeper, but neither of us was quite ready to cross that line. Yet, even without saying anything, we both knew it was there, the unspoken desire, the tension, the undeniable pull between us. The room had grown quieter, the subtle hum of the air conditioning now a distant background noise, as if it, too, recognized the delicate shift in the air. Dar. Winters continued with the exam, but the atmosphere between us had changed. It was no longer just a routine checkup, it had become something far more personal, more intimate. Her movements were deliberate, measured, but there was a lingering awareness in the space between us, a silent tension that neither of us acknowledged out loud but both felt keenly. She leaned in closer, her body slightly brushing mine as she adjusted the equipment. The closeness was electric, and despite her professional demeanor, there was an undeniable softness in the way she worked. Every touch, every glance, seemed infused with a quiet understanding, an unspoken desire to maintain a connection that went beyond the clinical. I could feel the warmth of her body so close to mine, and each subtle shift of her hand, each movement of her fingers, sent a ripple of awareness through me. I had to remind myself that this was an exam, that I shouldn't be reading too much into the way she lingered, the way she looked at me when she asked questions. But I couldn't help it. There was something in the way she moved, something in the way she focused on me with an intensity that felt more personal than professional. Her hands brushed against my skin with a deliberate gentleness, and I found myself drawn to the delicate warmth of her touch, the weight of her presence in the room. It was as if every part of me was tuned to her, attuned to the subtle rhythm of her body, her movements, her voice. As she asked me to breathe deeply, her fingers pressed lightly against my chest. I could feel the softness of her touch, the way her hand seemed to linger just a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't sexual, not in the way I might have imagined, but it was something more, a quiet, unspoken connection that neither of us was ready to break. The weight of her gaze lingered on me as I breathed, and for a moment, I felt utterly exposed. It wasn't just my body she was seeing, it felt like she was seeing me in a way no one else had, really seeing me for who I was, not just a patient in a medical setting. Her eyes were steady, and though she never said a word, I could sense the pull between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Her touch, her gaze, the way she hovered just inches away, everything about the moment spoke of something more than just a routine checkup. There was a quiet desire in the air, a longing that neither of us dared to voice. But I could feel it. She could, too. And we both knew that this moment, this connection, wasn't something either of us was ready to let go of just yet. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching the moment out until there was only the sound of our breathing, the weight of her touch, and the silent understanding that this was more than what it seemed. We were standing at the edge of something deeper, but neither of us was quite ready to cross that line. Yet, even without saying anything, we both knew it was there, the unspoken desire, the tension, the undeniable pull between us. The exam was finally coming to an end, and Dr. Winters stepped back from me, the space between us now somehow feeling larger than it had just moments before. The soft click of the stethoscope being placed back on the counter seemed to echo in the stillness of the room, signaling the end of a chapter, but neither of us moved quickly. We lingered in that shared space for a moment, the air thick with everything unspoken. The examination had been thorough, yet it was clear that the intimacy of the moment hadn't just been about checking my vitals, it had been about something else entirely. Dr. Winters took a step back, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her notes on the chart in her hands. Her gaze flickered briefly to me, and in that instant, the quiet understanding between us remained, unchanged, but still present. She smiled that same soft, reassuring smile, one that had come to feel more like a subtle promise than just a polite gesture. There was no rush, no sign of discomfort. The tension between us, though still palpable, had softened into something more familiar, something calm and resolved. "You're all set," she said, her voice steady, but with an underlying warmth that only deepened the connection we had been building. There was no awkwardness in her tone, no hesitation. It was as though everything that had passed between us, the silent glances, the lingering touches, the moments where we both seemed to hold our breath, had been understood without words. The room was no longer filled with the same charged energy, but there was still something lingering, something that neither of us had yet let go of. I swung my legs over the side of the table, standing up and pulling on my jacket slowly, feeling the weight of the moment, the quiet intensity of what had just happened. Dr. Winters was busy organizing her things, but there was a brief moment where our eyes met again. She didn't look away this time, and neither did I. There was no need for words, everything that needed to be said had already been conveyed in the way we held ourselves, in the way we moved around each other without speaking, and in the space we had allowed each other to fill. She handed me the chart, a final piece of paper, her fingers brushing against mine once more. It was brief, but the contact sent a quiet shiver through me. I took the chart, my fingers lingering on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. There was a softness in her expression now, something that told me she understood the depth of the quiet moment we had shared, understood the silent tension that had built between us without ever needing to acknowledge it aloud. "I'll see you again soon," she said, her voice calm but filled with a warmth that made me believe there was more to come. No promises. No rush. Just an unspoken understanding that the connection was real. That it was something we could both walk away from, but it would stay with us, unresolved but deeply felt. As I walked out of the room, I couldn't help but feel a strange peace settle over me. There was no need to push things forward too quickly. What had passed between us, though quiet and subtle, was enough. And for now, that was all I needed.